Okay, thank you all very much for attending the webinar today. Just a few of the ground rules. Each of you are muted, so if you have a question, click on the chat portion of your Teams meeting and submit a question through chat. I'll be able to see your question as you submit it. However, I'll wait till the end to answer the questions that are submitted during the presentation. Okay, the way we got started with COVID-19 is we have worked with fever screening equipment for many years. Not as fever screening equipment, but in the environmental world, using infrared to find hydrocarbon leaks. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we then looked into selling fever screening equipment for the pandemic instead of selling the infrared equipment to find hydrocarbon leaks. As we got into the research and looking at COVID as papers started to become available, we realized a couple of things. One, my daughter worked for 2 COVID doctors in London as in their household. Both those COVID doctors got the coronavirus, which meant, I started to question how much did those doctors really understand about the transmission events. Subsequent to that, we've also had multiple other instances where I started to question what was available and the guidance that was being provided. 6 feet didn't make any sense to me from a particle transport and what I understand about particles. We, in the environmental world, have dealt with particles, less than 10 micron particles regulated for a very long time. And there's nothing magic about 6 feet when it comes to particle transport. So I was a bit confused about this 6 feet rule. The other element is the removal of particles, which is in the environmental world a big deal. Particulate filters to remove particles from process streams before they're emitted to the atmosphere. And we have certain basic understanding of particle removal. And a mask also had a lot of questions whether a mask would be protective. The third element was that social distancing and a face covering are basically 500-year-old technologies or 1,000-year-old technologies. Covering your face in the sand from a sandstorm or isolating or quarantining yourself, that dates back to Roman times and Egyptian times, at least 500-year-old technology. I didn't understand why these two extremely simple things of 6 feet of social distancing and face covering would be the only means of reducing transmission events suggested by the CDC. So I wanted to look into it and understand exactly what happens to a particle. And so we did that, and that's what my paper goes through. My paper details the exact particle transport and the particle behavior. And there are multiple technologies invented in the last 500 years, some of them in the last 5 years, that will greatly reduce the risk of transmission. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is some of the measures that you can take to reduce the risk of transmission. Obviously, we need to set the stage for understanding those technologies, and that starts with understanding the behavior of the particles. So what is an aerosol? What is aerosol-based transmission? How big is a coronavirus-laden particle? And is coronavirus transmission aerosol-based? And what is an effective face covering to prevent aerosol-based transmission? Wait, why do we have that last one in here? I'll deal with that later. What is WHO's recommendation for social distancing? What is the CDC's recommendation for social distancing? Does social distancing prevent aerosol-based transmission? What is the theory behind social distancing? And what is an effective social distance? What is airflow pathway? Can airflow pathway management prevent transmission? Are there super spreading people or super spreading conditions? How many people can one symptomatic person infect? Can asymptomatic individuals transmit the virus? And how long does it take for one person to infect another in a 10 by 10 by 10 room? Those are some of the questions that we're going to ask. If you have questions, again, submit those questions via the chat, and we can ask or answer those additional questions. Here are some additional questions that we're going to talk to. I'm not going to go through every single one of these questions. We'll get to the meat of the answers here. So what is an aerosol particle? The ACGIH considers a 4-micron particle to be aerosol. The reason the basis behind that initially was that is what was believed to have deposition in your lungs. That is a sound basis. However, for the coronavirus particle, it's 0.1 microns, the size of the actual particle, the size of the actual coronavirus. So that's something to keep in mind as I go through this. Particles less than 7 microns are referred to aerosols because they're easily entrained in the airflow pathway rather than settling to the ground. Basically, those particles are dominated by Stokes' law with Cunningham slip or diffusion. These particles will change direction with airflow until encountering something that would trap them, such as the alveolar region of your lungs. As I went through the calculations, I realized that Cunningham slip is an extremely important concept with regard to coronavirus, because that is the size particles subject to Cunningham slip have the highest deposition rates in the alveolar region of your lungs. And the alveolar region of your lungs is where the oxygen molecules reach the hemoglobin, and that's the purpose of your lungs, is to transfer oxygen to your hemoglobin, and that occurs in the alveolar region. Well, it turns out that particles roughly the same distance as the distance between oxygen and nitrogen particles in the air those particles are subject to Cunningham slip. And nitrogen and oxygen molecules in the air are 70 nanometers or 0.7 microns apart. I'm sorry, 0.07 microns apart. A coronavirus particle is roughly 0.1 microns. So it is very, very close to the average distance between molecules in the air. And what that means is that the particle is going to experience Cunningham slip. Much smaller particles will behave much like a molecule, like the oxygen or nitrogen molecules. They'll have random motion. Much heavier particles will not change direction with airflow as easily, and they're more easily removed. Now, mind you, this is true of all particles of that size. And this is something that environmental engineers have realized for a very long time, that larger particles are easily removed, very small particles are easily removed, but particles of a size equal to the mean distance between molecules in the air are extremely difficult to remove. This is an environmental, engineering truth that applies to all particles of that size. And what that means is these particles will not be removed by things in a room. They won't settle on a table or on a doorknob. They won't be removed by a filter in your HVAC vent. They won't even be removed in your tracheobronchial path. In other words, between your nose and mouth and where your lungs begin. They're also not removed in the upper pulmonary region of your lungs. These particles subject to Cunningham slip basically only are removed when the airflow changes direction in your lungs. So when you breathe in, you take a breath and the air is going in a negative direction, down towards the bottom of your lungs. Once you stop breathing in, it now has to change direction and it comes back out. So it had a velocity of 0 at one point in time. Because it went from a negative to a positive number, it had to pass through 0. And at that time, it's subject to Cunningham slip. It's not removed. It goes all the way down to your alveolar region. This is why all viruses that become effective and live in nature are in this range of 0.1 microns to 3 microns. Almost all viruses that affect humans are in that very narrow range, subject to Cunningham slip. So what is aerosol-based transmission? Aerosol-based transmission is an indirect form of transmission, as opposed to, say, fomite-based transmission. Oops. It's a good thing we're practicing. Okay, so aerosol-based transmission is when the particles are suspended in the air and then inhaled by a susceptible individual. Other modes of transmission are if the particle settles onto a surface and you then touch that surface, which is fomite-based transmission, or someone coughs on you or sneezes on you directly, and say you're 18 inches from someone looking at them and they cough on you. That's an expiratory event. The contact tracing studies have shown that the bulk of the transmission is aerosol-based transmission. One particular study was around 95% aerosol-based transmission. When the pandemic first happened, there was a lot of focus on fomite-based transmission. I have no reason to believe, based off of my understanding of the particles and of the case studies out there, that either expiratory events where someone coughs right in someone else's face, or fomite-based transmission where you touch a surface, accounts for any meaningful percentage of the transmission events. The bulk of the transmission events are aerosol-based transmission events. As I said earlier, coronavirus is 60 to 140 nanometers in diameter. So this is a scanning electron microscope image of a coronavirus particle. As you can see, these exist in groups of 1, 2, in some cases 3. Most of them are not in clumps larger than 1, 2, or 3. What that means is the particles are in this size of a single micron. A single coronavirus instance is 60 to 140 nanometers. So 2 of those would be 120 to 280. And again, they're averaging 100 nanometers or 0.1 microns. 3 of them would be 0.3 microns. So these are particles of a size that will be very subject to very high deposition in the alveolar region of your lungs. Is coronavirus transmission aerosol-based? Again, as I've stated, I believe this is 95% plus is aerosol-based. My own personal experience, I come from a very large family, 142 people in my family, including my brothers and sisters, their spouses, their children, and children's children and spouses. And 12 of those 142 have contracted the virus. All 12 of those can be related back to aerosol-based transmission. So that's my own personal experience. Of course, there's the study of 100 plus transmission events with contact tracing, which showed 95+% aerosol-based transmission. And why is this important? Well, when 6 feet of social distancing and wearing a mask were the initial recommendations, the belief was that it was primarily fomite-based transmission. Well, we now know it's not fomite-based transmission. It's aerosol-based transmission. But the recommendations to prevent transmission haven't changed. Logically, this does not make any sense. If the means or mode of transmission changed, the mechanism to prevent transmission should have also changed. They're not the same means to prevent a fomite-based transmission versus an aerosol-based transmission. If you want a couple of specific examples, the Washington Choir case study, which is the very first study I came across, and I read this study and I instantly questioned, well, this could not possibly be a fomite-based transmission event. This has to be an aerosol-based transmission event, logically. Because one symptomatic individual infected over 50 people. For that to be a fomite-based transmission, that one person would have had to go and handle up on every donut that the choir ate. If it were a droplet-based transmission, which is a non-aerosol, the droplets are the great big particles, 1350 microns or higher, great big particle. Sort of an expiratory event where you're virtually spitting upon someone. No one would participate in a choir where some person was spitting upon every other person in the choir. It's just not practical. In addition, the fact that you couldn't spit that far. You couldn't cast droplets upon 50 different people. It's just not possible. You'd have to run around for an hour and a half, coughing on all these different people. So to me, that was a super obvious aerosol-based transmission. With an aerosol, you would simply, you're breathing, singing, and aerosols are generated. They float around the room. Over a 4-hour period, they would fill the entire room with millions of aerosol particles. And all of the people in that room would breathe in those particles and get infected. And that is what happened in the Washington Choir example. As I started to look at more examples, the same is true. So that is my basis, both understanding the particle size, the particle behavior, understanding what aerosolizes, and looking at the case studies and realizing there's really no other explanation for this, for these case studies. I'm wearing glasses today, and when I breathe out, my glasses fog up. That's because there's a small space between my mask and my face. And these small particles, these aerosol particles, especially the coronavirus-sized particles, the ones subject to Cunningham's slip, they're going to go right out there with that air. In addition, these are 0.1 micron particles. An N95 mask is 95% effective, but for larger particles that are 30 to 100 times the size of a coronavirus particle. So a mask may filter out large particles, even some of the aerosol particles at the higher end of the aerosol scale, say 3 to 7 microns. They will not be filtering out coronavirus particles. And if you're in a room with somebody for 2 or 3 hours and that person is breathing and they have an occasional cough even into their mask, they're going to put about 3 million particles in the air. The mask simply is not going to be protective. A mask is not designed for an enclosed space with an infected individual. It is not effective. Wearing a mask may still be a recommendation and a fine recommendation. Just don't be confused that a mask will protect you in an enclosed space. If you're in an enclosed space with a symptomatic individual for multiple hours, a mask simply will not protect you. What is the recommendation for who? For social distancing from who? So the WHO recommendation is 3 feet, and that ties back to a 1930s study. This is an improvement over the 500-year-old technology, moving up to 1930s and using 1930 studies. But the 3 feet is based off of if you cough or sneeze, the very large particles, where will they land? And again, this is the science behind this. When you cough, a particle has an initial velocity. Eventually, the momentum of that particle, the force of that particle, becomes equal to the drag created by air. And at that point, it stops traveling in this x direction. And now it will begin to settle. So this is called the stopping distance. The stopping distance is when you look out horizontally and you cough, those particles come out and they stop at a certain place. That's called the stopping distance. We calculated that for different size particles. The time that it takes to where it leaves your mouth, that has a velocity in this x direction. Eventually that velocity comes to 0, again, as the force of drag is equal to the force of the particle. It comes, when that happens, the velocity goes to 0 in the x direction. Now it begins to settle. It begins to settle at a velocity known as the settling velocity. So this particle will now begin to settle. Well, if the airflow velocity is higher than this settling velocity, then the airflow will carry this particle up into the air, and the particle will fly around the room as the air movement goes in the room. So just to review that again, on a cough or a breath, the particles have an initial velocity coming out of your mouth. That velocity eventually goes to 0. The distance that it takes for that x velocity to go from x initial to x 0, or final, that is called the stopping distance. The amount of time that it takes is the relaxation time. Does social distancing prevent aerosol-based transmission? No, because social distancing is effective for a small range of large particles that will settle to the ground. Aerosol particles can stay suspended in the air for 3 to 16 hours and remain infectious. Again, these particles may remain in the air for days, as depending upon the ventilation of the room. Another case study is 3 teachers in Arizona. They were all exercising social distancing, all wearing masks, and followed the fomite-based transmission guidelines. All 3 of them, or the 2 of them, contracted the coronavirus from the symptomatic individual, and 1 of those passed. This is super unfortunate, as had they been educated about aerosol-based transmission, and that in an enclosed space, the aerosol particles will fill that entire space, and everyone in there breathing those particles will become infected. Social distancing really does not mean anything in an enclosed space. What is the theory behind social distancing? Again, the basis for social distancing is the idea that the particles fall to the ground before reaching an individual. Those particles would be large particles subject to Newton's law. It turns out that the vast bulk of the particles that come out of your mouth during a normal breathing or a cough are far smaller than the particle size required to be governed by Newton's law. So again, here we have a slightly more detailed view of relaxation time, stopping distance, and settling velocity. I think I covered this one previously adequately. So what is an effective social distance? And what size particles, and what is the settling velocity and settling time? So for a 0.068 micron particle, which is the size of a coronavirus particle, the settling time is 3.67 million seconds. As you can see, it doesn't settle. It just simply does not settle in a time frame that someone would occupy a room. Even a 7 micron particle is 1,350 seconds. And again, a 7 micron particle is much larger than a coronavirus particle. A 100 micron particle would take 6.7 seconds. Now, that's assuming that there is no airflow in the room. That's in a room with no ventilation and no doors, no windows. And the walls were all the same temperature. Basically an isothermal condition. 100 micron particle, the settling velocity is 0.297 meters per second. Well, it turns out ventilation in most enclosed spaces is about 1 meter per second. So that's when you can feel airflow across your skin. Well, 1 meter per second is greater than 0.297. So this means even a 100 micron particle will not settle to the ground. It'll become aerosolized. Now, to put this into perspective, what is a 100 micron particle? How big is that? Well, 50 micron particles are the smallest particles that your eyes can see. In other words, if someone were spitting upon you or talking gregariously or singing and they had particles coming out of their mouth, you could see a 50 micron particle. Well, as you can see from these calculations, a 100 micron particle will become entrained in the air. So, the only particles that are subject to the Newton's law or airborne are these particles much larger than what you can see. So, as you can see from this graph, a 1350 micron particle has a settling velocity of 5.7 meters per second. And a settling time of 0.347 seconds. And again, a 1350 micron particle, that is a very, very, very large particle relative to a particle coming out of someone's mouth that would be heading towards you. In other words, that's 70 times the size of the smallest particle that you can see. I just highly doubt that anyone would stand next to someone that was popping out particles 70 times as large as what they could see and stay around that person for any significant amount of time. So what this really means is these droplet, what is sometimes referred to as droplet particles, really are not responsible for any meaningful portion of the coronavirus transmission, because no one in their right mind would stand next to someone spewing particles 70 times the size of a visible particle. So if the coronavirus transmission events are from aerosol particles, what does that mean, and how does that apply to social distancing? Well, as you can see in this graphic, if the speaker is up here in the left-hand corner and the air is coming, the air from the air conditioner is in this corner and the air intake is in the hallway, the air is going to go from here to here. If this person is infected, the particles are going to go take this path. And that means pretty much all of these people, but certainly the people here, are going to experience a lot of exposure to aerosol particles. If you move that speaker to the door, none of these people are experiencing any kind of exposure event. Now, this person in the middle, well, they could be 6 feet here, and they could be 6 feet here. They're 6 feet from the door, and they're 6 feet from the vent. When the speaker is at the front of the room, 6 feet away, they're getting showered with aerosol particles and a tremendous amount of exposure. The second slide, they're also 6 feet away, yet they have no exposure. So what does 6 feet mean? 6 feet means nothing in an aerosol transmission event in an enclosed space. It's simply not a relevant parameter. The example I use is this person could be wearing one red shoe and one blue shoe. Well, if they're wearing one red shoe and one blue shoe, it's not going to have any bearing on whether they get or transmit or contract the coronavirus. Well, neither does 6 feet of social distancing. If this person in the first slide or the first chart were 1 foot from the speaker or 5 feet from the speaker, they're going to get particles. If they're 15 feet, they're going to get particles. Now, if you close this door, it's even more profound. It doesn't matter where they are in the room. The entire room fills with aerosol vapors. And they can be anywhere in the room. They're still going to get exposed to roughly the same degree. So this graphic shows the importance of airflow pathway rather than the importance of social distancing. Pathway is important. Distance is simply not a relevant parameter in an enclosed space. So again, as I said, if you move this speaker from here to here, these people are not being exposed. A question that's commonly asked is, what about the exposure of the speaker to the people in the room? That's a legitimate question. The speaker is going to be producing a far greater number of particles than any of these individuals. But it is still true that any of these individuals with coronavirus, especially if these doors are closed, are going to give everyone in there the coronavirus. And that's why fever screening is the greatest risk reduction technique available. If no one in the room has coronavirus, then there's no transmission risk. One thing that I read a lot was these references to super spreading people. And each time I followed the article through it became very apparent that there are super spreading conditions, not super spreading people. If you put a COVID-19 infected person into a room with no ventilation with 20 other people, there will be a super spreading event, but it has nothing to do with that individual. It is simply the conditions that created the virus transmission. So how many people could one symptomatic person infect? And that's about 200 people. One adult inhales 10,000 liters of air per day. About 5,000 particles are generated per breath. And per cough, it's about 75,000 particles. And again, this 75,000 number comes from a different infectious disease, not COVID-19, but someone with a respiratory infection that coughs. This number is roughly 75,000. So what this means is about 3.25 million particles are generated per 8-hour period. A person needs between, well, if they had a viral load of 15,000, that would infect 216 people. at a viral load of 5,000, you can infect 648 people. We don't know what the exact viral load requirement is. What we do know is that the bulk of the cases involve exposure events in an enclosed space of more than 1 hour. The Washington Choir case was 4 hours. The Chicago birthday party was an afternoon birthday party. Within the refining industry today, there have been multiple meetings, afternoon meetings, from 1 to 4, and those meetings resulted in transmission events. How many people can one person infect? A lot. More than you could fit into most rooms. So one question that comes out a lot is asymptomatic people. Hey, fever screening doesn't affect or doesn't catch asymptomatic people. But the symptomatic individuals account for about 93.6%, according to one particular study. That is also consistent with what you would expect based off of the particles. At the early onset of COVID, your body is not fighting off the disease, and you have an accumulation of particles. At some point, that accumulation causes you to start to cough to get those particles out of your body. And therefore, you're going to have the greatest number of particles at that point in time. Symptomatic individuals in this particular study accounted for 93.6% of the transmission events. Only 6.4% occurred prior to the onset of symptoms. Yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier with the viral shedding is maximal when symptoms appear and decreases exponentially thereafter. That's somewhat is common sense, but is also validated from prior studies. Yeah, the second study is also showing an asymptomatic person leading to much lower infection rates, 0 to 2.2, whereas symptomatic people have a 0.8 to 15.4. It's what you'd expect, but it also validates aerosol-based transmission. If it were fomite-based, there wouldn't be such a dramatic difference between people that are coughing and people that aren't coughing, between particle generation from symptomatic individuals, whereas an asymptomatic person doesn't generate aerosol-based particles. So how long does it take for one person to infect another in a 10 by 10 by 10 room? In 2 hours, a room would contain an average 165 particles per cubic foot from one symptomatic individual. A person at rest breathes 0.212 cubic feet per minute. therefore consuming 35 particles per minute or 2,000 particles per hour in this example. It turns out that if you calculate the number of particles in a space and then ask the question, how long would it take based off of that particle density for someone to contract the virus, well, the calculations match what we observe. Almost all of the transmission events in the case studies are between 1 and 4 hours, which correlates to about 2,000 particles. So a viral load over a 4-hour period would be 8,000 particles. So what we see in the real world correlates to what we would expect based off of the calculations. Yeah, so what this is going through is, where and how a particle will land. We talked about this a little bit, but this is a really nice comparison of one to the next. So inertial impaction is where a particle subject to Newton's law, or the upper end of the Stokes range particles, if they encounter a curve, well, they cannot change direction adequately, and they will run into the curve. Whereas with diffusion, the particle is so small, it is moving randomly like Brownian motion. And so the particle is very small compared to the distance between oxygen and nitrogen particles or molecules. So you can imagine, the best example of this is perfume. So perfumes, the things that give perfume smell are extremely small. This allows them to move in a random motion, and if you open a perfume bottle, someone 10, 20 feet away can still smell that perfume relatively quickly, because those molecules are so small. They go jetting across the room, never running into a nitrogen or oxygen molecule, and jet all the way across the room to hit that person's olfactory nerve. So very small particles, they're subject to diffusion. They act like a molecule and have random motion. They'll travel until they run into something, which means they're going to be easily removed in your nose. So all the very small particles will get removed in your nose or your mouth, not make it into your lungs, which is why the viruses that we see in nature, the ones that are effective, they're all larger than that. They're all up where they are subject to Cunningham's slip, larger than the mean distance between nitrogen and oxygen molecules. This is a graph that came right out of a mechanical engineering book, or an environmental engineering book, and it just shows this dip that you see where particles that are very large are easy to remove, particles that are very small are easy to remove, and the particles in that tight range are much more difficult to remove. So 3 or 4 three coronaviruses together with some amount of material between them, some mucus that is holding them together, and that's why they're a glob of three. They're going to be right here, just in this perfecto sweet spot between 0.1 and 1 microns. And that means they're going to be difficult to remove and make it all the way to your alveolar region. So what is particle deposition? This thing is, these two graphs, I won't go through them in too much detail because you can look at these for a long time, but this extrathoracic region is the, that's your nose and your mouth. And these two charts are one for your nose and one for your mouth. One on the top is for your nasal breathing, and the one on the bottom is breathing through your mouth. And the ET, or extrathoracic region, that's for the nasal, is between your nose and the trachea. And you can see the removal rates are very, very high for large particles, and very, very high for extremely small particles. That's the random motion, the Brownian motion. So the ones on the right hand of this graph are particles. They're big, that crash into your nose hairs or your mucus in your nose or into your mouth on the bottom graph. And the very small particles, you can see 0.01 microns, they also have very high deposition because those particles are subject to Brownian motion. They have random motion. They're going to run into the side, inside of your nose or your mouth. The deposition in the upper pulmonary region, I'm sorry, in the tracheobronchial pathway, you can see that is also, that's higher for the smaller particles that were not removed in the extrathoracic region. The peak there, the 0.01 to 0.03, that's the pulmonary region. That's the part that I'm talking about, the alveolar region at the very bottom of your lungs. That's where the deposition is highest for those particles between 0.01 and 0.1 microns. And again, this is the coronavirus is about a 0.1 micron particle. So these are HEPA filters. Are HEPA filters effective for aerosols? You can, and of course it depends upon the HEPA filter, but HEPA filters can be effective in this region. You can see it drops down into this 99.94 instead of 99.99, but you can still have very high removal with a HEPA filter. And this is why airplanes are the safest place for you to be, because airplanes have HEPA filters that remove particles below 0.1 microns. The airflow pathway is also optimal in an airplane. So the vent comes in above your head, goes across your body, and out below your feet. Now, I rode on an airplane this past weekend, and I watched and sat where there was no one in front of or behind me, and I pointed the vents from the row in front of me away, creating a little curtain, pushing the air away from me in the front. Behind me, I pointed those away. There was no one in there, so I had a little curtain, a little air curtain behind me. And I sat in the middle seat, and the aisle seat, I pushed that one away from me, again creating an air curtain. And then the one above me, I pointed towards the return vent at the base of my feet. And I know that goes through a HEPA filter of 0.01 microns. So I had a virtual air curtain and a HEPA filter with a 99+% above 0.01 filtering my air. That's the safest I was ever going to be since the coronavirus happened, the pandemic happened, was sitting there on that airplane with my little air curtain and my HEPA filter air. Yes, this is talking about air travel. The most dangerous place when you're traveling is, unfortunately, most of the airlines or airports in the U.S. do not have fever screening yet. So the employees that stand in the terminal all day long, if they had coronavirus, they could fill that terminal full of aerosol particles, which is why I would go in at the very last minute that I could, knowing that I could still make my flight, staying outside the airport where there's fresh air before I went in there, exposed to those workers who have not been fever screened. Obviously, they should have fever screening at those airports multiple times a day so that the workers inside the airport could not have the virus filling the terminal with 3 million coronavirus-laden particles. Again, this is the math. I didn't want to get too much into the equations at the beginning and turn people off, but this is Newton's law. This is the exact equation that showed the results that we had previously. And again, for Newton's law, that's something that the weight of the particle determines its behavior. Think of a marble. If you drop a marble, the drag from air on a marble, the settling velocity is virtually unaffected. The other particles are Stokes' law particles, and those are particles that are heavily impacted by the flow of the air and the drag. So the particles between those two sizes are called intermediate particles. These are the equations for the various particle sizes. And again, the mean free path between oxygen and two oxygen molecules or oxygen and nitrogen molecules in the air is 68 nanometers. And again, I've been using 70 occasionally, and I think that depends upon whether you're taking the middle of the molecules or the edges of the molecules. Again, Newton's law of range, it turns out that this is a 1350 micron particle is that's how big a particle needs to be governed primarily by Newton's law. And again, that's a particle that is considerably larger than a particle that you would see emanating from someone. Particles in this range have a settling velocity of 9 meters per second. So these would be responsible for fomite-based transmission. Again, the obvious limitation here is how many people do you see walking around speaking so gregariously that they have particles flying out of their mouth? And this may be a problem in a bar setting or a sports venue. Probably not responsible for very much transmission in a professional setting. From 1350 down to about 100 microns is that intermediate range between Newton's law and Stokes' law. These particles could travel 10 to 20 feet before they start settling, but again, once they start settling, if there's airflow, then they can become entrained in that airflow. That was the chart that we saw earlier. The last set of particles are particles subject to Stokes' law. Now, things subject to Stokes' law can also have two separate categories. One subject to Stokes' law with alveolar, with Cunningham's slip. So when does Cunningham's slip become important? That's based off the Knudsen factor. And again, this Knudsen factor is dependent upon the diameter of the particle relative to the mean distance between oxygen and nitrogen molecules. This is the natural phenomena that gives rise to viruses being the size that they are. It turns out nature understands Cunningham's slip. Even if the CDC is not quite caught on to the importance of Cunningham's slip, viruses do. All the viruses are subject to this Cunningham slip. And of course, the cause and the effect are obvious. The virus is much larger than particles subject to the Cunningham slip, won't have the same efficiency of getting deposition and being breathed into your lungs. Whereas particles much smaller, too small to be subject to Cunningham slip, those particles are subject to diffusion. As you can see, that when Kn is greater than 1, the particle mean free path will not collide with other particles. This approaches diffusion and results in low deposition rates. So again, think extremely small particles result in a high Knudsen's number, which means they will not be subject to Cunningham slip. So this is stating what I had just stated, which is these particles between this 0.01 and 1 are highly affected by Cunningham slip because they have just the right Knutson's number number. And again, this is just nature. Nature understands the math. Nature responds to what is the truth of Cunningham slip. Whether someone understands Cunningham slip or not, the successful viruses are viruses most subject to Cunningham slip. Yeah, so this is now re-showing these same graphs that we saw before, but after the explanation of Cunningham slip and Knutson's number. And again, I think I actually said all of this stuff earlier, so I don't need to repeat it. Large particles will crash into things in the extra thoracic region, as will very small particles. So particles with a high Kn number or a very low Kn number. That's all of these particles with these high deposition or high removal rates in the extrathoracic region before it gets to your lungs. The highest deposition occurs here in this range. Where viruses exist. Okay. Some of the questions. What is symptomatic screening? So yes, symptomatic screening is, and this came out very early in the pandemic, is the main symptom is temperature or febrile. Nearly everyone that has symptoms has a fever, and therefore measuring a fever is a very accurate way of identifying symptomatic individuals. And that's called febrile screening. I know Fauci recently made a statement about fever screening not being effective. Well, possibly you could argue that temperature screening isn't effective if the screening device has a too large of error rate. That would be on CDC because the equipment meeting the requirements of febrile screening for 510 FDA 510K approval, the accuracy of that equipment will absolutely determine when someone has a fever. ICI's febrile screening equipment it is accurate within 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. A low-grade fever is 99.4, and people that show a low-grade fever are symptomatic. Does that mean they have COVID? No, it may mean they also have some other infectious disease. But febrile screening will remove symptomatic individuals. Uh, if you use equipment that calls itself temperature screening rather than febrile screening, that may mean that it doesn't meet the FDA 510 requirements. It may not have the accuracy. So if you're using equipment with a plus or minus 2 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously the person could have a 101.4 temperature before, and you still let them pass onto your property. That, as I showed before, one person could infect 600 people. That could have disastrous results. So it's extremely important that if you procure fever screening equipment, procure 510K approved equipment. Procure equipment that is accurate, because when it comes to data, bad data is worse than no data. You don't want to allow people into an enclosed space believing that they are not symptomatic when they in fact are symptomatic. Yeah, it says, do you have to be 6 feet of separation if you're wearing a mask, say an N95 mask? Again, that question has to depend upon what kind of environment you're in. If you're in an enclosed space for 3 hours, 6 feet of separation, nor an N95 mask is going to protect you. If you're in an outdoor setting with fresh air, the N95 mask would protect you from an expiratory event. So if someone coughed in your face, your mask would protect you from those large Newton-like particles, and it'd affect you from droplets. But neither 6 feet of social distancing or a mask has any bearing in an enclosed space. They're simply not going to protect you. What can be implemented in building air systems to reduce the spread of COVID-19? It's a very good question. If an enclosed space, so what happens is a building is constructed and the HVAC system is designed to produce an airflow of about 1 meter per second. The reason is that's when you can feel airflow. People feel they feel like they have proper ventilation when they can feel the airflow. That sounds weird, but it's so a lot of ventilation systems are based off of 1 meters per second. But then people come in and start putting in walls and putting in lofts and other things, and cubicles, and that disrupts the airflow. Now you may have spaces with lots of eddies or with little or no ventilation. So how do you determine that? How do you know if you've got these spaces with low flow, low air exchange? Well, one way is to do CO2 monitoring and aerosol monitoring. The limits of most rooms are based off of fire marshal limits. Well, a fire marshal limit doesn't have a whole lot to do with whether it's safe from an infectious disease perspective. However, if you do the CO2 monitoring, if there are too many people in a room, you'll see an increase in CO2 because people breathe in oxygen, they breathe out CO2. If you're not getting enough air in there, you're going to see CO2 concentrations rise. And so that's one way of identifying those rooms which are not adequately ventilated for purposes of infectious disease. There's an argument that could be made that says, really independent of COVID-19, let's say they invent a vaccine next week and we all don't have to worry about COVID-19. Well, there's still all the other infectious diseases that are out there. And there's the next infectious disease. And the rooms really should have an appropriate number of people to maintain adequate ventilation. Not just the number of people that can fit in the room or the number of people that could escape in the event of a fire. In modern times, and again, the face mask and the social distancing are 500-year-old technologies. The fire marshal occupancy loads for a space maybe comes from the Triangle Factory fire era of whatever that was, 100 years ago. We now have modern equipment where we can know the CO2 concentration and the aerosol concentration in a room. That would be the infectious disease limit for a room, which to me seems somewhat logical that in addition to a fire marshal limit for each room, you would have an infectious disease limit for each room. Someone asked, can you address field work setting? There's just not a lot of cases of transmission events occurring in outdoor settings. My brother, about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, had a wedding for his daughter. We had 200 people at the wedding, right in the middle of the coronavirus, all outdoors, all in tents, no transmission events. About 2 weeks ago, a different couple in the same county where I'm from in Illinois had a wedding, 200 people at the wedding. One person came to the wedding even though he was symptomatic and should not have come to the wedding, believing he was doing the right thing. Did not stay out in the main hall. He went back into one of the smaller rooms and spent the bulk of the wedding there in that small enclosed space. Unfortunately, 20 other people that spent time with him in that enclosed space also contracted the coronavirus. It's an example of the greatly elevated risk in an enclosed space. Whether I didn't go look at the room when I was home. I thought about it, and I should have. If the room that they were in was actually a post-construction modification without ventilation. I suspect it was, which is why just the 20 people in that enclosed space got it, and no one else outside of that space got it. But in an outdoor setting, what you have to watch out for is the opportunities for enclosed spaces. So if it was in a trench-like setting, obviously you have CO2 buildup there that you have to watch. But also before and after work. believe one of the refining companies during a turnaround had about 100 exposure, 100 incidents of COVID transmission. The belief is that most of those occurred at night at restaurants and bars and in the hotel settings, with poorly ventilated hotel spaces, poorly ventilated restaurant spaces. Sometimes at the turnaround, the local hotels are full, and so you take an hour ride to and from the refinery with several other people to a hotel an hour away, and that 2 hours in that car. So a car is a very small enclosed space. So I am aware of a case where one person symptomatic was in a car with 3 other people. They drove to a spot that's multiple hours away. All 4 of them, of course, had coronavirus afterwards. The one gave it to the other 3. But they met up with some people. One of them met up with their girlfriend, and the girlfriend did not get COVID-19. That, to me, is a real testament to aerosol-based transmission versus fomite-based transmission. And it's also relevant to your question, which is project field work. The greatest danger for project field work is the car ride there and the car ride back. Obviously, a lot of the fatalities in our industry are vehicle-related fatalities. People driving home late at night after a long day of work in the field, falling asleep, or getting up early in the morning to drive to the project. They want to get the project done in one day, and so they drive there for 3 hours and do the 6 or 8 hour project and then try to drive home. Well, that 3-hour drive is a very high COVID risk environment. The best thing they can do to protect themselves in that environment is to roll down their windows. My family drives around in cars with the windows down all the time now. So, the outdoor setting, when they're doing work outdoors in a project, the risk is probably very low when they're doing the actual project work. Their greatest risk is on their way to the project, on their way home from the project, or at night in restaurants with no outdoor seating. That should just be a no-no. Just only have approved restaurants, and the only restaurants approved are restaurants with outdoor seating. If you're doing a very large project like a turnaround, I would also recommend you certify hotels. So all the turnaround employees have to be at approved hotels, they have to eat at approved restaurants, and they have to drive to and from the project site with their windows down on their vehicles. It's a very long answer to that question. Thank you all very much. I don't see any more questions. If you do have follow-up questions after reading this material and hearing the material, feel free to email or call me. The email's on this slide right here. Well, not really, because that slide's missing, but we're going to add that slide, aren't we, Bailey? Yes, we're going to add that slide. Sorry for going an hour and 45 minutes. I'm going to have to go faster next time.